Right from the start, the conversation around Brad Holmes has taken on a different weight, far more complex than simple praise or criticism. When you break down every decision from the moment he arrived in Detroit, the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't about painting Holmes as flawless or as a disaster. It's about taking you, a Detroit Lions fan, inside every real move he made, exactly as it happened, and confronting the pattern those choices created. Because when you go back through the drafts, the free agency windows, the risks he took, the swings he connected on, and the misses that left marks, everything starts to make sense. You begin to understand why this fan base sits between gratitude for the progress and frustration over the holes that could have been avoided. So get comfortable, because today we're diving deep into that story, and none of this is guesswork, it's fact, it's context, it's Detroit. And before we roll on, make sure to drop a like on the video to support the channel and help this content reach even more Lions fans. It begins with the draft classes, where the story is almost mythic at the start. That 2021 group was the kind of foundation-laying moment franchises dream of. Penei Sewell falling into Detroit's lap at 7 felt like fate stepping in. You add Alan McNeil, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Derek Barnes, and suddenly you're looking at a rookie haul that hit harder than almost any Lions draft in decades. Sure, not every pick stuck, but the core that did was enough to turn an A grade into an identity-defining class. That was the moment fans first said, Holmes gets it. Then comes 2022, a draft that still divides Lions fans at every tailgate. Aiden Hutchinson was the right pick. No debate. He outperformed the edge rusher comparisons people made on draft day, and Holmes walked away vindicated. Jameson Williams was a massive gamble that paid off later, and you could understand why the team stashed him, because at that point Detroit wasn't built to compete immediately. But this was also the year you start to see the cracks forming. Joshua Paschal's injury history wasn't hidden. Malcolm Rodriguez was solid. Kirby Joseph was a hit. Yet the combination of injuries and inconsistency marked the beginning of a trend Lions fans have watched grow louder ever since. And then Holmes delivered lightning in a bottle. The 2023 draft, the one fans still talk about like an urban legend. Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell, Sam Laporta, Brian Branch, an absurd run of A-plus selections. Every one of them an immediate answer to one of Detroit's biggest weaknesses. That draft bought patience, bought belief, bought time. But at the tail end of that very same class, something else crept in again. Broderick Martin, Hendon Hooker, Colby Sorstel, Antoine Green. Those late-round misses weren't catastrophic, but they hinted at something different. A shift. A little too much confidence. A little too much assumption that every swing would connect. And that shift carried straight into the 2024 draft, where the wheels didn't come off, but they definitely wobbled. Terrion Arnold looks like he can become a player. Ennis Rakestraw Jr. has talent, but injuries followed him. Giovanni Manu was a pure luxury pick. Sione Vaki hasn't made real noise. Makai Wingo hasn't found the field. Christian Mahogany, a 6th rounder, might be the second best pick in the class. And when a 6th rounder is your silver lining, the alarm bells aren't subtle anymore. No edge rusher opposite Aiden Hutchinson. No investment in the most glaring roster hole. And that's where frustration really takes root. Because it's one thing to miss. It's another to believe your roster is complete enough to justify luxury picks while one of the league's most obvious needs stares the whole city in the face. Free agency tells the same story. Year 1, you can forgive almost everything. That roster was a teardown. Jamal Williams was a great signing. Alex Anzalone proved to be one of the most important defensive leaders. But as the years went on, the hit and miss pattern sharpened. 2023 gave Detroit David Montgomery and C.J. Gardner-Johnson home run signings, but also Cam Sutton, a mistake that unraveled in real time. Emmanuel Mosley came in injured. Marvin Jones Jr. didn't work out. A few picks were fine, a few were forgettable, and a few called into question just how much risk Holmes believed he could afford to take. Then came the more recent cycles, where the inconsistency became impossible to ignore. Kevin Zeitler? Great. DJ Reader? Great in concept, questionable in performance. Marcus Davenport? A swing that didn't just miss, it backfired. Letting Tim Patrick walk? A mistake that genuinely hurt. And through all of this, somehow, the one move everyone begged for, the pass rusher, never came. Not in the draft, not in free agency, not at the trade deadline. And when the deadline hit, when the window was wide open, the decision was to stand still, to declare the roster good enough, to take the season and put it on the line without addressing the one issue every single fan, analyst, and rival scout could see. Holmes has done too much good to be fired. That idea is nonsense. But that doesn't mean his decisions haven't slowed the momentum Detroit earned the hard way. He built the offensive line. He rebuilt the culture. He nailed cornerstone picks. But he also missed with injuries, gambled unnecessarily, and ignored the edge position to a degree that now feels reckless. So the question now becomes the one only fans can answer. After looking at every draft, every signing, every risk and every hesitation, do you feel Brad Holmes has learned from these trends? Or are you concerned that the same mistakes could cost Detroit again? And when you step into the heart of this conversation, you feel the tension between gratitude for how far this franchise has come and frustration for how avoidable some of these setbacks were. Because after laying out every draft class and every free agency swing, the truth is that Brad Holmes has always been capable of brilliance, yet recently he's also been capable of letting opportunities slip right through his fingers. And that's where Lions fans are split. You can't ignore how many foundational players he's delivered, but you also can't pretend the roster holes he left unaddressed weren't obvious enough to see from space. Take the timeline from 2023 forward. Detroit had momentum, identity, and belief. This fanbase finally had a front office that seemed to understand them. And yet as Holmes moved from the A+ draft into the next cycle, you could sense a shift in the way he evaluated his own success. It wasn't arrogance in a personal sense. It was roster arrogance. The belief that the Lions had arrived, that they were deep enough, talented enough, and stable enough to withstand gambles on luxury picks or injury-prone players because the foundation was set. But the NFL punishes assumptions, particularly assumptions about pass rush, depth, and durability. And when Holmes started treating high-value picks like lottery tickets instead of necessities, the cracks began to spread. The 2024 draft made those cracks impossible to ignore. Detroit was drafting later, sure, and that makes the board harder. But drafting later doesn't excuse drafting lightly. Roster strength doesn't excuse bypassing impact needs. And when the Lions walked away from that class with only 2 real contributors and still no meaningful help for Aiden Hutchinson, it set the stage for a season where the defense once again had to overextend to compensate for what wasn't fixed. By the time the trade deadline rolled around, the fan base wasn't asking for a superstar. They were asking for effort, activity, urgency, and instead, the message sent was, we're good. The defense wasn't good. The edge rotation wasn't good. And now Holmes had to live with the consequences of a decision he knew would define the year. Fans don't expect their general manager to be perfect, but they do expect him to recognize the moment, and that moment slipped past Detroit without resistance. And free agency didn't offer much reassurance. For every Kevin Zeitler or DJ Reader that looked smart on paper, there was a Marcus Davenport signing that turned into a sinkhole. For every quiet win like Amick Robertson, there was a move like releasing Tim Patrick that made zero sense in the broader arc of the roster. And while Holmes found gems early in his tenure, the recent cycles feel less calculated and more reactive, as if the front office is constantly balancing between patching holes and pretending they don't exist. Meanwhile, the Lions walk into another offseason with limited cap space and a shrinking margin for error. That's why this conversation matters, especially now. Brad Holmes built the core that changed Detroit's future, but sustaining a contender, choosing the right moments to be aggressive, recognizing which weaknesses can't wait, understanding when depth becomes destiny, that's a different level of pressure. And while nobody is calling for his job, the expectation is clear: he must adapt. The luxury pick era has to end. The injury gambles have to stop. The roster gaps can't be ignored anymore, because the window the Lions fought so hard to open won't stay open forever, and the choices made from this point forward will determine whether Detroit becomes a perennial threat or a cautionary tale. So now I want to hear it straight from you. Do you believe Holmes will correct course and get aggressive when it matters, or are you worried that the same patterns could hold this team back when the next big moment arrives? Then you start looking at the decisions that didn't happen, the moves Holmes didn't make, and that's where this conversation stops being theoretical and becomes real. Because every season has a pivot point, a moment where a front office either leans into the opportunity or steps back and watches it pass. And for Detroit, the most glaring one was the trade deadline. Fans weren't asking for a blockbuster. They weren't begging for a superstar. They were simply asking their general manager to acknowledge what everyone watching could see. The pass rush wasn't good enough, and it wasn't going to magically fix itself. Aiden Hutchinson needed real help, not rotational maybes, and the defense needed a closer, someone who could turn pressures into sacks and stall drives into momentum. Holmes didn't make that move. He trusted the roster. He believed development and scheme would carry them through. And while loyalty to your players is admirable, in the NFL it can also be dangerous. The longer a weakness remains unaddressed, the more damage it does, not just statistically, but psychologically. Games start slipping away in the fourth quarter. Opposing offenses stop feeling threatened. Your best players are forced to overcompensate. That's exactly what happened this season, and it wasn't unpredictable. Fans called it, analysts called it, even opponents acknowledged it. And the frustrating part is that Holmes has proven, multiple times, that he can be bold. Trading up for Jameson Williams, believing in Jahmyr Gibbs when everyone doubted the pick, building the offensive line the way he did, those were aggressive, decisive choices. But when the roster screamed for an edge defender, that same willingness wasn't there. Instead, Detroit entered a crucial stretch of the season counting on hope instead of reinforcements. Then you turn to free agency, where the theme is the same, smart moves mixed with avoidable mistakes. Kevin Zeitler was a home run. DJ Reader symbolized a bigger vision for the defensive interior. But Marcus Davenport was a risk that had red flags from the start, and it played out exactly the way fans feared. Releasing Tim Patrick was simply a misread. Carl Davis's departure left more questions. And while Amick Robertson, Khalil Dorsey, and Roy Lopez were solid, they weren't the kind of moves that shift a season. What makes this even more complicated is that Holmes has put Detroit in a position where these decisions matter. These aren't the 3-13-1 Lions anymore. These aren't the at least we're better than last year Lions. These are the Lions expected to contend, expected to win playoff games, expected to take advantage of a competitive window that doesn't stay open forever. When your expectations rise, so does the cost of hesitation. That's the part Holmes must confront now, because as much as fans appreciate how far he's taken this team, this next stretch of his tenure won't be judged by foundational rebuild moves. It'll be judged by precision, by timing, by recognizing which decisions can wait and which ones can't. And right now, the pressure is higher than it has ever been. The roster is talented, but thin in key spots. The cap is tight. The defensive line still doesn't have that second hammer. And the margin for error in the NFC is shrinking as quickly as the schedule moves. So the question lingering over Allen Park right now isn't whether Brad Holmes is the right GM. He has already proven he is. The question is whether he can evolve from the architect of a rebuild into the architect of a sustained contender. Whether he can shift from taking swings to making targeted strikes. Whether he can recognize that Detroit has climbed out of the basement and now must compete on the roof. This is where Detroit's future pivots, and it's where Lions fans are watching every move more closely than ever. Which brings us to you. After everything we just broke down, do you trust Holmes to push this roster forward with the urgency a contender needs, or does his recent decision-making leave you unsure about the next step? And when you think about what comes next, that's where the weight of Holmes' decisions becomes even heavier, because the Lions are no longer the scrappy underdog trying to prove they belong in the conversation. They are the conversation. They're the team every contender has circled, the team nobody overlooks anymore, the team whose success is no longer a surprise but an expectation. And once a franchise reaches that stage, the margin for front office hesitation shrinks to almost nothing. Holmes now finds himself entering the phase every successful GM eventually reaches, the moment where hits alone aren't enough. At this level, you're judged by what you correct as much as by what you build. Detroit's identity, culture, and core were masterfully constructed, but sustaining that level of competitiveness requires a different mindset, one that treats roster gaps as emergencies instead of inconveniences, and one that recognizes the difference between betting on potential and securing production. That's why the lack of urgency at edge rusher looms so large over this entire conversation. It's not just that the Lions need another pass rusher, it's that everyone knows it. Opponents know it. Fans know it. Even players have commented, directly or indirectly, on how much pressure is placed on Hutchinson to carry a load that was never meant to be his alone. And as the season stretches deeper and the stakes rise higher, this isn't just a roster flaw. It becomes a storyline that weighs on the entire defense. The difference between a good team and a great team usually comes down to one or two positions, and the Lions are living inside that truth every week. Then you look at the cap space shrinking, the number of contract renewals approaching, and the reality that not every beloved contributor will be able to stay. This upcoming offseason is going to require precision, not projection. Holmes won't have the luxury of throwing darts at developmental prospects or rolling dice on medical histories. Every pick and every signing will need to hit closer to the level of what he delivered early in his tenure, not because fans are impatient, but because the roster demands it. The irony is that Holmes has the intelligence, track record, and instinct to navigate this perfectly. He has already shown he can outdraft entire divisions. He has shown he can find value in free agency that other teams overlook. He has shown he can spot talent where others see risk. The challenge now isn't capability, It's adaptation. Can he shift from the mindset of a builder to the mindset of a finisher? Can he recognize that Detroit isn't searching for identity anymore? They're searching for edges, inches, and separation? Because this is the evolutionary step that defines whether a franchise stays competitive for one window or evolves into a yearly threat. And right now, Lions fans are living in a moment that generations before them never had. The chance to see their team become a sustained contender rather than a temporary surge. But that future rests heavily on the decisions Holmes makes from this point forward. No fan expects perfection, but every fan expects urgency. They expect awareness. They expect the same hunger that has fueled this entire rebuild from day one. Because if the front office matches the intensity the players bring on the field, there's no ceiling for what this team can become. So as this chapter continues to unfold, the biggest question hanging over the franchise is this. Do you believe Brad Holmes is ready to make that shift from building the Lions to finishing them into a true powerhouse? And this is where the pressure on Holmes becomes more than just front office scrutiny. It becomes a defining moment for what Detroit wants to be in the long term. Because when a franchise reaches the phase the Lions are in right now, the window doesn't politely wait for the perfect timing. It opens, it challenges you, and it forces you to decide whether you're willing to make the uncomfortable, aggressive, calculated decisions required to stay on top. That's the phase Holmes is in. The rebuild phase is done. The feel-good phase is gone. Now it's about championships, not progress. It's about seizing momentum, not celebrating it. The Lions finally have a core that rivals the best in the NFC. The offensive line is among the strongest in football. The young playmakers on offense can change games instantly. The secondary is youthful talent paired with experience. The culture Dan Campbell built is powerful enough to carry a team through adversity. But all of that only matters if the front office keeps the roster evolving instead of settling. Every contender that falls backwards does so for the same reason. They assume what was good enough yesterday will be good enough tomorrow. The Lions cannot afford to make that mistake. Holmes' toughest decisions are not behind him, they are directly ahead of him, and they're going to test every part of his philosophy. He must decide when to go all in. He must decide which contracts to prioritize and which hard goodbyes to accept. He must decide whether this team is one aggressive move away from taking the next step, or whether patience and development are still the safer road. And those decisions will define not just the upcoming season, but the next era of Detroit Lions football. Because as much as fans appreciate the progress, nobody wants this run to be a brief spark. Detroit has waited far too long, suffered far too many setbacks, and fought through far too many rebuilds just to experience temporary relevance. This fan base wants permanence. They want sustained success. They want to know that the foundation Holmes built is strong enough to carry not just this team, but the next versions of this team as stars age, contracts expire, and expectations rise. That's why every move from this point forward matters more than the moves that came before. The core is built, the culture is built, the expectation is built. Now comes the phase where the Lions need a front office operating with playoff urgency every single day of the year, not just when the roster is empty, not just when the team is rebuilding, but especially when the team is close. And the truth is, fans feel it. They see how close this roster is. They see how many pieces are in place. They see how few steps are left between Detroit and the kind of team that terrifies the rest of the conference. They know that the wrong moves can stall a contender just as easily as the right moves can elevate one, which is why this fan base is watching everything Holmes does with a sharper eye than ever.